Welcome, friends, to another of the bi-monthly series, Global Capitalism Live Economic Update. And I'm your host, Richard Wolff. Welcome. Glad to be back talking with all of you. As you know, we are a project sponsored by three organizations: the Judson Memorial Church on Washington Square in New York City, which is where we normally have these events in the church itself. But obviously, because of COVID-19, we are not in a position to do that at this time. The Left Forum is the second organization that sponsors these events, an annual gathering of academics and activists on the left to share experiences, analysis, and to build a new left in the United States and to cooperate internationally. And finally, the organization that literally produces each of these events, Democracy at Work. You can find out all you need about our organization by going to our website, democracyatwork.info, I-N-F-O. Again, before leaping into the urgent materials that are on tap for tonight, I wanted to make a plea briefly. These are difficult times for us, as they are, I know, for all of you. Bitter conflict rages across the world, pandemic, economic collapse. That's what we're going to be talking a great deal about this evening. And I know it affects every one of us, mostly in multiple ways. But it does impose on us a request. When we have these events at the Judson Memorial Church, the people who attend are asked to contribute $10 per person for the evening, which they graciously do. Obviously, we are not in a position to raise those sums because we are doing this online. So let me ask you, those of you who find these presentations useful and interesting, help us out as best you can. The easiest and simplest ways are two. Number one, go to our website at patreon.com/GCLEU. Patreon, that's Patreon, patreon.com/GCLEU. That's the easiest way. And the second way, especially if you want to make a one-time donation, is to go to our website. That's democracyatwork.info/donate, and it'll be very clear to you how to proceed. We would enormously appreciate whatever help you can provide. It makes it possible to produce and distribute these programs every other month. Okay, with the business out of the way, let me jump into where we are here at the beginning of July 2020. It is, let me start with as stark a statement as I know and that I feel entitled to make. I've lived a good long time, and I have never seen the American economy in worse shape than it is at this moment. Problems that U.S. capitalism has had throughout its history have remained unresolved, unsolved. They haven't been overcome. They have been, as American politicians like to say, kicked down the road, postponed, put off, hopefully either to solve themselves, which in the case I'm about to tell you has not happened, or maybe just to go away and not bother who's ever in a responsible position. But they haven't, of course, solved themselves, and they haven't gone away. What's worse is five of them, are now converging on the United States at the same time. And whereas any one of them was daunting, which is why our system could not solve it, having five at the same time is why I opened tonight's talk the way I did, that we are at a genuine systemic crisis. So let me briefly go through the five, because we'll be returning to them all evening. Here are the 5 crises. The first one is the climate crisis, the ecological crisis. For the whole history of US capitalism, corporations have made decisions, as always, by the small number of people who own the businesses or the small number of people who are on the boards of directors representing the shareholders, and again, very small group, making all the key decisions: where to invest, how to invest, what to do with the profits, etc. And as they made those decisions, they were not required, and therefore they never did, take into account the ecological damage they were doing, how their production decisions fouled the water, fouled the air, dumped toxic waste into the water systems, into the ground, caused noise pollution. You know, ever since Rachel Carson alerted us so many years ago, those corporations imagined that somehow all of that ecological damage, which they didn't have to pay for, which simply accumulated, would somehow take care of itself. It didn't. And we now face a world threatened by rising air and water temperatures, with a changing climate producing floods and droughts, and, as we'll see, a whole host of social problems. It's now urgent. We know that from the fires and the droughts all around us. It's a problem that is now urgent for capitalism in its lack of a solution. We've even allowed corporations who make profits off fossil fuels to stand in the way of a change in our energy basis because it's not convenient to that tiny minority of profiteers, no matter what the damage to the system. The second crisis of capitalism is its business cycle. Ever since there's been capitalism, for the last 300 years since it began in England and spread around the world, capitalism has had a crash, a downturn, a recession, a depression. We have so many words. Every 4 to 7 years, the system is periodically deeply unstable, and it throws millions of people out of work every few years, destroys businesses, thousands of them, every few years. It is, short, a terrible problem. Now, here at least capitalism has tried to come up with solutions. It even developed a whole new economics called Keynesian economics after the founder of it in England in the 1930s. But it didn't work. It wasn't able to find a solution. It never could end the cyclic instability. And we're going through one of the very worst of them right as we speak. Problem not solved. Crisis here and now. The third of the 5, racism here in the United States. Inherited from slavery, capitalism, as we'll talk in a few minutes, made use of racial difference, institutionalized it, created a subordination for African American people, a second-class citizenship, a bad treatment across the board. And periodically, because African Americans are, after all, our brothers and sisters, they couldn't stand it anymore. They pushed back. They did it in little ways and then occasionally in big ways. And always there was the bemoaning alongside the repression. And the bemoaning, we need to do something. Yeah, we need to, but we didn't. The problem remains as deeply embedded as ever and as sharp when it explodes as ever. And we see it all around us now, again, the mixture of a repression to respond to it and the protests that want finally this problem to be solved. And like all problems that fester for a long time, when they finally reassert themselves, it's harder than ever to deal with them. So that's the third crisis. U.S. capitalism is now confronting. Two more to go. Well, you know the one that's obvious, the pandemic, a virus. Viruses have horribly threatened human society for thousands of years. A bare century ago, in 1919, we had a terrible virus that killed 700,000 people here in the United States. We know, or rather we should know, what a virus is and why it is crucial to be prepared and to manage it if it comes. But that is a failure in the United States, a total failure, which I will come back to. And therefore it is now a crisis. Coronavirus is now a deadly disease across the United States, resurging staggeringly across the country, threatening the little bit of resumed economic activity that had been prematurely welcomed. A terrible crisis we are living through. And finally, fifth, the crisis of inequality. Over the last 40 years, all pretense that American capitalism was a rising tide that lifts all boats has been smashed. The middle class that came out of the revolt of the working class in the Depression of the 1930s, a revolt that got Social Security and unemployment compensation and strong unions negotiating good contracts with real benefits. All of that has been destroyed for the overwhelming majority of working people in the United States. From representing 1/3 of the working class, today unions represent 1/10 of the working class, and barely that. The unions were destroyed. And in the course of that process, alongside it, maybe even the other side of that destruction, we have a worsening inequality. In the 1960s and 70s, the United States was a less unequal society than the rest of capitalist Europe. We have now surpassed all of capitalist Europe to become the #1 unequal society. And it is tearing this country apart, not only because it is a division of society that's unsustainable, but it's particularly galling in a country that used to celebrate its vast middle class and now has to ignore the fact that that vast middle class is fast vanishing. And here's the worst of it. Over the last 15 weeks that we have gone through this pandemic, the richest Americans have become much richer still, while 42 million people lost their jobs, lost their incomes, or most of them. It is a catastrophe in which the inequality that was already a crisis becomes worse. And that is itself a crisis on top of a crisis. Any society plagued with any of these problems would have its work cut out for it. But a society like the United States, with its particular history, cannot possibly handle 5 of these crises at the same time. But it's exactly the problem. And everything else we're going to talk about tonight should be looked at in the framework of these 5 critical problems, unsolved, staring in the face of a society that literally is disintegrating. So let's begin. The first thing is I'd like to quickly talk about a few of the symptoms of this society convulsed by these 5 crises. And we have a number of them. First of all, the bizarre language that we have to choose, our leaders tell us, between getting sick or dying on the one hand and having a functioning economy, as if you couldn't have an economy that functioned without risking people's lives. The United States is a disaster in handling this crisis. It has no right to force such a choice on people without at first explaining that to whatever extent that choice is real, it is the result of failed policies that could and should be corrected. Otherwise, the disrespect for human well-being, life itself, being shown by the leaders of the United States is so extreme that it is, of course, a sign of people confronting crises they cannot handle any other way than this assault on the sanctity of life. Another symptom of the chaos and the confusion of all these clashing, imploding crises is the following gross fact. The European Union, as of the first week of July, was reporting roughly 5,000 new cases of COVID-19 per day. At the same time, the United States, which has less population than the EU, was reporting in the neighborhood of 50,000, a 10-to-1 ratio. There is no excuse. There's barely an explanation for so grotesque a failure on one side of the Atlantic compared to the success on the other. It's a sign of a society out of control. You can be angry at the particular leader, the president, but it goes far deeper than that. It has to do with a system that has too many crises and too few solutions. Another symptom of the confusion of all these crises is the talk, particularly from Democrats as well as Republicans, about a return to normal, as if that were the goal, as if that were a solution or a policy. The blindness revealed by such talk is staggering. It's the normal of the last 50 years that got us here. It was normal to ignore ecological damage, normal to pretend that the business cycle was either tamed or overcome or solved. It wasn't. It was normal to claim that race relations were on the improvement and were now a thing of the past. All of this was the normal that got us to where we are. Returning to the normal would be the equivalent of having jumped off a train headed towards a stone wall, only to think that now that you're standing and the train is going by, maybe what you ought to do is get back on the train. No, you shouldn't. And then another one, the peculiar rediscovery, particularly here in the United States, of quote unquote liberty and freedom. This is downright bizarre. We hear from Fox News on across the right-wing spectrum the statement by people who refuse to wear masks, who refuse to engage in social distancing. Some kind of weird argument that as individual Americans, they should be, must be at liberty, free to not wear a mask, so that if they cough or sneeze, they can infect other people. It's their liberty, we are told. And they can get together with other people, which spreads the disease, because they must have their liberty, we are told. It's as if a person told you they needed to be free and were not going to be constrained by any government putting a red traffic light or a green traffic light in their way. Excuse me, you're part of a community, and your freedom comes from that community and is required to be respectful of that community. Otherwise, it isn't freedom, it is anarchic war of each against the other. But for a big part of our population, this argument becomes a kind of refusal to deal with the virus and, like any of the other crashing crises. One last comment about all these crises. Hidden here, but I'm interested in putting it forward, is the peculiar eclipse of conservative economics. You know, the kind of economics that tells you that capitalism works best if the government keeps its hands out and off, that government is best which governs least. You don't hear that too much. And you know why? Because we've now had two catastrophic collapses of capitalism in 10 to 11 years. One in 2008 and 9, and the other one right now. Catastrophic in their implications, with the economy only hanging on this side of total collapse because of the massive intervention of the government, bailing out the banks, the large corporations. These days, the little corporations, the small businesses, the unemployed masses, you name it. Everything is suspended as the government comes in, pouring trillions of make-believe dollars into the system, desperate to keep it going. This is capitalism with a big G for the government. And nobody, including the conservatives who as recently as 3 months ago were giving their usual speeches about how we don't need the government, you don't hear that anymore. The government is everywhere. The government is the only way capitalism can survive. And one of the ways we know it is that all the major capitalists are desperately scrambling over one another to get their hands on government support. All right, let's turn then to talk about the issues for today that are on the docket, that are on the agenda, particularly here in the United States, but it isn't that different many other places as well. I want to begin with racism. It has been the dominant topic alongside the pandemic and the economic crash here in the United States for weeks now, ever since the police murdered George Floyd in Minneapolis. I'm assuming you all know much of the details. I will not repeat them. I'm interested in explaining why racism has been a problem in this society for so long, has been kicked down the road, not solved, why institutionalized and systemic racism are part of the United States today and part of the crisis of capitalism in the United States alongside the other four. And my explanation is not very complicated. Here it is in a nutshell. Capitalism, as I've already pointed out, and as you all know, is an unstable system. On average, every 4 to 7 years, it has a downturn. Suddenly, people are thrown out of work, businesses cut back production, or become bankrupt altogether. It's a terrible time. Sometimes they only last for months, other times they last for years. They can be mild, they can be catastrophic. The one we're in now, catastrophic. Okay, capitalism would long ago have disappeared had everybody, the entire working class, lived in a constant anxiety and fear that the next crisis, which is never more than 4 to 7 years away on average, would affect them, would make them lose their job, thereby their income, thereby their mortgage payment to keep their home, thereby their children's education. It would drive people crazy. They would know, even if the current crisis bypassed them and got their neighbor, that likely 4 years from now, the story would be a reverse. Terror, fear, anxiety, impossible for a system like that to have survived. Well then, what's the answer? Because capitalism did survive. And the answer will explain racism. What became necessary for capitalism to survive was to divide its working classes into basically two sections. One section would be effectively told, not necessarily explicitly in words, but one way or another, given to understand that the ups and downs of capitalism would not hurt them. They wouldn't be the fired ones. They wouldn't be the ones to lose their income. The system would go up and down, but they would be safe. And how is that possible? Because a second part of the working class was given the horrific social position of absorbing all of the ups and downs, all of the instability of capitalism. Think of this other group as though it were a kind of economic shock absorber. As the system goes down, these are the people who lose their jobs. When the system goes back up, these are the people who are called back in to the jobs. Last hired, first fired. A group of people who become the living embodiment of capitalism's instability. People who can't put down roots, people who can't afford a home, or if they do, can't maintain the mortgage payments or the rental payments when they are thrown out of work, which they are the first to suffer each economic downturn that capitalism dishes out. And in the United States, that group was primarily African Americans. They were put in that position. They were kept in that position not only by police brutality and all of the well-known mechanisms, but by a much more fundamental one, the very structure of the system. Last hired, first fired means you cannot afford to live in a comfortable way, in a home, in a safe neighborhood, all the rest of it. Impossible. We also can see that when the African American community wasn't big enough to do the shock absorbing, well, then poor whites were added. That's happening now, and we will come back to that. But the African American was put in an awful position. But of course, capitalism could never accept responsibility for what it was doing to the working class by splitting it in this way, by making some supporters who were safe and turning them against the others who were not safe, who were the shock absorber of capitalism and suffered all the consequences of being put in that role. So what capitalism did, and here it comes, folks, was to suggest that the reason some people lived the way African Americans have mostly been stuck in ghettos, poor education, inadequate medical care, insecure job histories, you know, I know, everyone knows. So what capitalism did is allowed, supported, encouraged, and often financed the notion that African Americans were in that position, not because capitalism needs a shock absorber, but because there's something wrong with them, something symbolized by a chemical in their skin. Is it crazy? Yes. But before you jump, remember, Europeans have done the same thing, mostly with immigrants, pulled in, ejected, or subjected to living in their ghettos with their inferior social services. Not the way the United States did, but not so different either. Racism is a product of the way capitalism survived. And that's why it has always been true. As Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and countless others understood. You want to deal with racism at its roots, you want to overcome it, then you cannot divide your working class into one section that are held safe in economic ups and downs, relatively, and another society that is destroyed by that instability. And that's the final point here. Because the economic crises are now so severe, the one in 2008 and 9, and now this even worse, African Americans are not enough. There's not enough shock absorption from that community. So you've had to add the Latino community, and you've had to add a growing number of white people. They too, last hired, first fired, made to absorb the instabilities that they had been led to imagine they would be immune to. They're not. And in that moment, As they face that, as it's literally forced on them by their bleak job prospects, by their bleak income prospects, by the fact they borrowed more money to get that bachelor's degree than they will ever be able to repay, they are now aware that they are like the African Americans. They're being assigned the same role, which is why the Black Lives Matter movement has as many white people on those protests as it has shown itself. That's why so many white people, particularly younger ones, understand. You know what it's like? It's like the recent year's demonstration that overdoses of opioids can kill white people just as well as it can kill black and brown people. Capitalism is running out of the ability to save itself by destroying a part of the working class by forcing it to be a shock absorber. That's the issue. No end to racism that does not confront its very functional service to the reproduction of capitalism. I want to turn now to the crisis itself, not the 5 contributing crises, but the whole breakdown that we are living through, especially those of us in the United States. And it's hard to get at all of it, but that's what I want to do in the time I have remaining this evening. First of all, the United States made a decision, and that's what it was. A decision different from, say, what was done in Germany or France or even England. And that decision was, faced with the pandemic and faced with what it implied for the economy, to throw 45 to 50 million people, roughly a third of the labor force, out of work, formally unemployed. Now, I could spend hours spelling out the implications of this. It is a staggering reality. Let me give you just some idea. First, it subjects tens of millions of people to a loss of income. Yes, I know. The extra $600 unemployment compensation actually enabled some people to earn a bit more than they had while they were working. But for the vast majority of people, it is the other way around. It's income lost. It takes time to get your unemployment check. They are not retroactive, etc., etc. And they threaten to run out within weeks from now. So it was a terrible blow in terms of income. But it was much worse in other ways. When you are unemployed, it means that you don't know if you have a job. You do not know whether you can go back to your job. Even if you can go back to your job, you do not know what the employer's conditions will be, what the salary will be, what the benefits will be, how secure the job will be. You know nothing. So in addition to being out of work, you are now ratcheted up with anxiety about your future. Number 3, massive unemployment operates in capitalism like an invitation to every employer to approach those people who still have a job, the 2/3 of the American labor force still working. The employer now can come to them and say, I have to cut your salary. I have to reduce your benefits. You have to come in a half an hour early. You have less time for lunch, whatever. Because the employer knows, as you know, that there are tens of millions of people out there ready to jump at your job, even with its reduced circumstances, because anything is better than the limbo and the uncertainty they're living with. And we already have statistics this last week, New York Times, Washington Post, that wages are declining across the United States. Of course they are. This is the ideal situation in a capitalist system for the employers to take advantage of the desperately unemployed. That's why it is quite important that in Europe, for example, I'll take Germany, unemployment went from 5% before the virus hit to 6% now. Whereas in the United States, it went from roughly 5% to roughly 20%. Okay, there's no comparison here. This is a disaster. But the disaster is now going to get worse. People cannot pay their rents. They cannot pay their mortgages. Stores are closed because of the virus, so they cannot open up for business. They cannot pay their commercial rents. A couple of statistics. Commercial rents, roughly half of them, have not been paid April, May, and June. Something like a third of residential rents haven't been paid. Okay, what does that mean? It means that landlords are not earning their money. Their tenants are not paying rent, neither the residential nor the commercial. So the landlords are in trouble. And they've informed the banks from whom they borrowed the money to build the apartment houses, to build the stores, the malls, and all the rest of it, that they cannot pay the interest or the principal of their loans. You see, the unemployment, the loss of the job and the income sets off a chain reaction, undermining all of capitalism. So what are the banks and the landlords and the tenants doing? Well, I'll tell you, they're all lawyering up. That's right. They're all pooling whatever resources they have to hire the most nasty, well-developed legal teams. The court papers have already been filed, only because the courts are closed. Or in a few states, there have been rules that you can't evict anyone for the next month or two, or maybe even 3 or 4. But the papers are all there. Many have been filed in those states where it's allowed, and there are many of those. We're going to have a war in the months ahead, a war between lawyers. And the people with the most money who can hire the biggest and the best connected lawyers will win. And the big businesses will destroy the little ones. And the medium will destroy the little ones. And the poorer the tenant, the less chance he or she has to survive. This isn't capitalism with its normal contracts for leasing. And this is the war of all against war. This is what happens when systems break down. It's just a question of who's connected to what judge, to what politician, who has the right lawyers, and they win, and everybody else loses. Is extremely important to understand this. And what would have been the alternative? Well, let's start with what it isn't. It surely isn't Mr. Biden and the Democratic Party establishment. They offer no solution at all. They're almost as blind to these 5 crises as the Republicans. Not quite, but almost. They too talk about returning to normal. They too have done nothing about the absolute horror of unemployment for 50 million people and the implications and the breakdown of the economy. They are like deer in the headlights, just like the Republicans. And it's amazing if you think about it. Why? Well, let's take a look. The last time you had massive unemployment in the United States, anything like what we have now, was the Great Depression. And let's remind ourselves, for the umpteenth time, what happened there? The working class said no, we're not tolerating this. They joined unions by the millions. They joined by the tens of thousands, 2 socialist and 1 communist party in the United States. And the Communist Party and both of the socialist parties and the CIO, the Organization of Unions, they worked together and they demanded something. And they went to the president, Roosevelt, And that something turned out to be, you better help us, Mr. President, or you're not going to be the president much longer. And Mr. Roosevelt understood. I won't repeat all the things that the working class won in the depths of a depression. Yeah, they got Social Security. Every one of their elderly, their parents, their grandparents, everybody over 65, a check every month for the rest of your life. Nothing like that has been accomplished now. Then they got unemployment compensation. That's why you get any unemployment now, because that had never existed before, just like Social Security never had. That was created by pressure from below by left-wing Americans. The first minimum wage. Yeah, not allow employers to do what they're doing now. Not only could they not cut wages, they had to raise them above the minimum. How different. But here comes the best one. Between 1934 and 41, Roosevelt created and filled 15 million jobs, a federal jobs program. The Democratic Party today seems to have developed acute amnesia. It forgot all about it. It makes no proposals, no commitments, nothing to deal with unemployment today the way it was done successfully the last time we found ourselves in this position. The bankruptcy of the Democratic Party establishment is spectacular and is also a symptom of a system falling apart because there are too many crises it cannot figure out how to solve. Well, what would be an alternative? And particularly if it is a crisis of capitalism, as it seems to me to be. And believe me, I have not covered all the bases. We don't have time in an evening like this. If I did have time, I would talk to you about the trillions of dollars manufactured out of nothing by the Federal Reserve, given by the Federal Reserve to big banks, by and large. That's the biggest beneficiary. Large corporations, also a major beneficiary. The Federal Reserve is now the backstop of the credit markets of the United States. It's directly funding corporations who borrow money by issuing bonds. It's directly funding the government spending. It's directly, literally, trying to buy its way out of dealing with those crises. It's another plastic cover for not solving those 5 problems, because trillions of new dollars do not solve not our racism problem, not our ecological problem, not our viral problem. They are a stopgap. They are a Band-Aid. And as that money has nowhere to go in the real economy, you can't produce more goods if you've got 40 to 50 million people unemployed who can't go to a store anyway. So the money that they're creating finds its way into the one place where rich people still go with their money, and that's the stock market, where they buy shares from each other, driving up the value of the shares out of all connection with an underlying broken economy. That disconnect, sooner or later, one way or another, will come back and make a 6th crisis the system cannot solve. But I want to talk about socialist alternatives. Well, let's start with what we could call the old socialist alternatives. And what are they? Well, you know them because they've been resurfaced very effectively and very dramatically by Bernie Sanders, by Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, and many others, socialists of our time, reminding us of a traditional socialist response. And here's that response. The government could and should step in to compensate for, to correct for the failures of capitalism. If capitalism cannot solve its problems, racism, ecological collapse, preparation for a virus, inequality, spectacular, then the government should step in. It should levy taxes that redistribute wealth from the rich to everybody else. It should come in with a Green New Deal, finally to deal with the ecological damage that has been done by an unregulated, ungovernmentally controlled private capitalism. It would have prepared for viruses the way we know we should have. It would have come in and said, okay, the private companies are not producing and stockpiling the tests, the ventilators, the masks. Okay, it's not profitable for them to do it, and so they don't. But that's not acceptable as public health policy, so the government will do it. And you all understand what I'm saying because we know of a very good example where the government does exactly what socialists would advocate for public health. It's called the military. You know, it doesn't pay a company to produce a missile and stockpile it in a warehouse, or a tank, or a gun, or a ship. That's not profitable. In the same way, it's not profitable to produce 1 million tests and store them around the country. You know how we solve the problem? How we have a military, even though it isn't profitable for a company? We arrange for the government to come in. And it goes into the company and it says, you produce a missile, we'll buy it from you as fast as you produce it. No worry, we'll give you a very good price. The profit is virtually guaranteed. And that's how we get the missiles, which the government then stockpiles at the government's expense, which of course means your expense, my expense. The government comes in because it wants a military. It wants to be militarily equipped, so it compensates for the failure of private capitalism to produce military goods the way the government deems necessary. Well, exactly the same thing could have and should have been done in the United States to protect public health, not in a military way, but in a medical way. This is childishly obvious. Only a capitalist system of the sort we have here in the United States failed to do that. All of the other industrial developed countries have national medical systems, sometimes in partnership with privates, sometimes on their own. But they know that relying on private enterprise would be lunacy. Only in the United States do we do such things. And that brings me to a very important point. The socialists, the old ones, were of course right. The government can and the government should compensate for the failures of the private sector to solve all kinds of problems, like public health and protection against viruses. Yes, the government can do that. And the lesson here, the lesson is that the reason it didn't happen in the United States is because we don't have any socialism here. After World War II, the socialist and communist parties were destroyed by repression, governmental repression, capitalist repression. And then the ideological work of terrifying the entire American working class about anything and everything having to do with socialism. That's 3/4 of the explanation for why we've had a Cold War with a country that calls itself socialist. Because it was part of rolling back the New Deal, getting the government out, reestablishing that peculiar ideology that says we don't need the government, we don't want the government, even though with every crisis of capitalism, the government is brought in like gangbusters. We didn't prepare because we don't have a socialist movement in America that would have made us have a national health service long ago, that would have taught us that the state can play a crucial role. Americans have been taught something completely different. The demonization of old socialism was the demonization of the state. The state cannot come in and compete with. The state cannot even come in and fix capitalism because if it does, it kind of exposes that capitalism leaves a lot to be desired. Capitalism isn't the best thing since sliced bread. Capitalism isn't the solution to the problems of modern society. And the capitalists didn't want that. And they were strong enough in the United States and Britain to prevail. They were not strong enough in continental Europe to prevail, which they regretted. But it meant that in those countries, for example, you couldn't throw tens of millions of people into unemployment, which is why they didn't dare do that in France or Germany or even England, despite having conservative governments. They can't. They wouldn't dare, just like they don't touch the national health insurance. No, the old socialists have a point. The government could have avoided a number of these problems, could have at least ameliorated them, could have done a lot better than a private capitalism that has no or minimum government intervention. The old socialists were right about that. But, and here's my conclusion, I don't think they can solve the problem either. I think the old socialists have to face something painful. Yes, the government could have and should have come in to take the steps that could have at least partially compensated for the failures of private capitalism, ecologically, in terms of the stability of the system, in terms of the racism, in terms of the public health preparation, and in terms of the inequality. It could have. But you have to answer the question, why didn't it? Why has the state, even when it has intervened, done so inadequately? And why do we need a state to clean up the mess of the private sector? Why do we have a private sector at all? And I think the answer lies this way. If you have a private capitalism that's strong, that controls enterprises, which is where the majority of people work, that gathers into its hands, and remember, the people who own and operate enterprises are a small minority everywhere. If you allow that small minority to gather into its hands the profits, the net output of a society, then you cannot be surprised that they use that money in ways that reinforce themselves and their position. That is what they do. And that means they will block the government from playing the role that the socialists have always advocated, which is why the old socialists are so often frustrated. Their government, the government they want to see, is always hamstrung, held back, limited by the private capitalism that remains, that wants more inequality for itself, that doesn't want to pay for the ecological costs that they can personally escape from, that never worried about the racism that divided the working class. So I'm afraid the old socialism isn't enough. And I ask those interested in the old socialism to leave space for a new socialism, which could be added and which would address the limits and failures of old socialism. And by that I mean that the new socialism transforms the enterprise. You've heard me talk about this before, and here's another way to explain why. If you transform enterprises from the top-down hierarchies that they are now, the undemocratic way in which a tiny group of owners, boards of directors, make all the decisions that the mass of the workers and the communities in which production is carried out, they have to live with those decisions from which they are excluded. That is a root failure. That creates the dominant position the domineering mentalities, just as it delivers the profits into the hands of that minority that dominates and is domineering, so that it can make sure that the government does not go beyond certain limited functions. The very functions socialists, the old ones, struggled so hard to achieve, but don't go beyond a certain point. The solution to that has to be that we democratize enterprises. That's right. We get to the root of the problem. What happens if you democratize an enterprise is that everything in the economy changes. Different people are now making the decisions of what enterprises do, how they react to anything that the government is doing or might do, how they react to the crises of our society, like racism, like inequality, like instability. They will handle those problems differently because a different set of people positioned in a different way in the enterprise are now decision makers. To get the idea across, I want to use a metaphor. You can organize a family, a couple of parents, let's assume a heterosexual family, a man and a woman, some children. You can run that family by giving, in a patriarchal sense, all decision-making power and authority to the man, the father, who goes out to work, brings home the money, and makes all the key decisions. Or you can have a partnership between the father and the mother, maybe even including the children, some of them, the older ones. And now what? The family faces a whole bunch of decisions, but those decisions will now be different. They will be handled differently because the woman, the mother, the wife has a different set of values and notions than the husband. They're going to have to work that out. They're going to have to compromise. They're going to have to differently react to what the children need and want. We're going to have a different outcome than what we would have had if we left all the decision making with the father. Given the way women have been socialized, for example, we might expect that a family governed by the father will not be very sensitive to issues of medical problems, given the way men are socialized. But if we have the wife next to the man, she, because of her socialization as being the one more focused on the children's illnesses, etc., on caring kinds of work which have been assigned to women in traditional households, she will bring a different sensitivity. She will be more likely to prepare for illness than the husband, to stock the medical shelf in the house with the good materials to handle illnesses or injuries. You get the point? If the workers are part of the decision-making apparatus, they will not do what the tiny, autocratic, undemocratic dictators inside of our enterprises do in the way of decisions. It's a fundamental difference. And I think that because the workers have to live with the pollution of the enterprise, they'll be much more sensitive to taking the steps to prevent it than the distant board of directors ever did. And I think their sensitivity to community and how you destroy community by polarizing rich and poor will also govern how they distribute the wealth that they all help to produce in their enterprises, how they distribute it amongst themselves. Thousands of years ago in ancient Greece, Plato and Aristotle had a debate in which they argued, and basically they agreed, that it was terrible, in the hope of sustaining the communities of Athens that they were so committed to, It was intolerable, unsustainable to have people divided into a small number who were very wealthy and a large number who weren't. It was destructive of community. It was destructive of social cohesion. Everything could and should be done to limit it, to prevent it. I think working people have understood that all through the ages. And I think if a democratic decision-making process were brought into enterprises, that a collective decision would never give some people billions of dollars while most people have trouble getting a college education for their children or a decent diet or proper medical care. It wouldn't happen. And I think that there's a lesson there. And I thought the best way to give it a concrete example would be to remind all of you of what has been true in rural communities across the world for a long time. If a member of a farming family that has a regular job becomes unemployed, that person is expected automatically to make use of his or her time off of paid employment by doing something constructive on the farm, building a chicken coop, expanding a storage space, clearing land, all kinds of things, because you can build wealth that way without going to your job and make something positive happen out of the period of time that you're not drawing your wage or your salary. Now imagine with me worker co-ops as the basic enterprise. Every worker co-op would understand that times will come when you can't sustain the work for all the people in the co-op because folks don't want to buy whatever it is you produce anymore because their tastes have changed. Or maybe there's a pandemic with a new virus, and so you have to keep social distancing and you have to do a variety of other things. It would then become logical and necessary for the worker co-op to have contingency plans. Every enterprise would, because its first role and goal is to build up the welfare, the wealth of the community, not the profits of a minority within the community. So every enterprise would have a plan, what to do if there was a fall off in demand for your product, what to do if there was a viral pandemic that had to be accommodated, how best to prepare, what other projects to have lined up, what other projects lined up that are coordinated with other enterprises that are making similar plans. You would have a society that could and would react completely differently, wouldn't dream of allowing 50 million of its fellow workers to be, quote unquote, unemployed. How wasteful. What are they going to do? Watch crappy television? Sit around feeling bad? Riddled with anxiety about what they would do? No, there would be an organized, available menu of socially useful things the members of an enterprise would do if and when perceivable interferences with their situation occurred. That's, of course, what we should have had in the United States. We have nothing like it. The people who run our enterprises are not concerned about what happens to the community. That's why they pick up and leave and go to other countries where they can pay workers less whenever they want to. That's why they replace workers with machines whenever it's profitable. That's why they close down enterprises when they're not profitable. It's not their problem what happens to those people, what the society loses by behaving towards those people in an inhumane, uncaring way. That's capitalism's normality. You know, the normal that Mr. Biden wants to return us to. We don't need the normal. We need basic change. And perhaps one of the most important positive outcomes of this crisis of American capitalism, and indeed of capitalism globally, this crisis of crises, these 5 crises crashing in, maybe a positive outcome will be to recognize that yes, we need the modern equivalent of a New Deal coalition. We do need a labor movement rising to the challenge of what is being done to working people now. And yes, we need socialist, communist, radical, left-wing political parties to mobilize people who can see the social need for change and who can understand the need for coalition with the working classes across the country. Yeah, we need that, just like they needed it in the 1930s. And we need to go for what the old socialists want from us. We do need a Green New Deal, and we do need a national health single-payer system. We need those things. Of course we do. But we have to go further. We got those things in the 30s, but then the private capitalists had their revenge. They undid the New Deal. They went after the left. They destroyed it. They destroyed the socialists and the communists. And then they went after the unions. They destroyed the coalition, which enables them now to get away with mass unemployment, failure to prepare for the virus, ecological neglect that is criminal. The left could have prevented that. It's the left that prevents the same things in Germany and France and so forth. Even though it's weak there, it's not as weak and not as destroyed as what happened in the United States. But then we have to learn the lesson. You have to go further than the old socialists did. Otherwise, we'll struggle very hard, reproduce what the old socialists had, and then watch it be undone by the very capitalists we've left in a position to do that. That would be an extraordinary tragedy. There is movement in the United States. There is movement around the world. People are protesting everything. Here in the United States, it is remarkable. Black Lives Matter leading in the protests of repression. But people are demanding the end of evictions. People are demanding radical alternatives, and they're doing it more and more in organized ways, collaborating with one another. The possibilities are very good. It's often that way, that when the danger is greatest, so is the opportunity. And I don't want to just end on a positive note, although that's important. I want to add a little darker vision as well. Unemployment gives every employer in America an opportunity to recoup the losses from today's capitalist crash, to recoup the losses from the pandemic by sticking it to the working class, taking advantage of the unemployment, to lower wages, to drive millions of people out of their homes, to destroy the last remnants of a middle class in the United States, so that we become the very society so many Americans prided themselves on not having. A few rich enclaves surrounded by a mass of abject poverty. We are at a crossroads in the United States, more so than I ever anticipated seeing in my lifetime. The stakes are enormous, the danger stupefying, but the possibilities for radical change, insight, and transformation are what keep us all going, and I want to be one who celebrates them. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate the wonderful communications I get from many of you. We ask again for your support, and I look forward to speaking with you again in 2 months' time.